there was justification, around xenophobic violence. What was he doing in South Africa? Why is this foreign national? And for Black mothers, it was a real threat. But for white women, it wasn't the same, And there have been a lot of other analyses that look at Black women's experiences vis-a-vis white women's experiences.
Hi everyone, welcome to iZwe Lami. My name is Natasha.
And my name is Kumo, and we are iZwe Lami. Today we're going to be having a discussion about the Black Lives Matter topic and the intersectionality of it all. And as a guest today, we have Sihle Motsa, who's going to be joining us in today's wonderful conversation. Sihle is a multi-dimensional woman. She is a master's graduate in art history, and she is set out to begin a lecturing position at Rose University. And above it all, she's also a feminist activist. Sihle, could you just tell us more about, what you do and your passions, on a daily basis?
So I currently am in between jobs. I was working as an advocacy specialist at an organization called Iranti. And then I'm now set to start teaching at Rhodes in the History of Art and Visual Cultures department. So I think a lot of people often think that, these are two very different fields. On the one hand, I have my activism, and then on the other, I have my interest in visual culture. But I think for myself, I just consider myself a very multi-dimensional individual who's also very interested in imparting change. I think I'm very sensitive to injustice, so I always try, to be in the fore where change is happening, to rage against the system always.
Okay. Yeah. So, today's topic, we wanted to go into kind of what has been happening around the world. We've been seeing a lot of the news coverage on the Black Lives Matter protest. And I think maybe to start it off on today's first question is, what is the Black Lives Matter movement? Because there's been a lot of questioning about that and just helping understand it. And why does there seem to be only maybe a discussion that emanates about it when it happens in America or when it happens in Europe?
That's a very interesting question. So I just want to start by saying that I don't personally feel that, I have the authority to speak on Black Lives Matter. So I'll just be sharing my observations, just be sharing, just bits and pieces of information that I've read about, and just my overall analysis about the movement and how we could draw inferences with what's happening in Africa, what's happening in other parts of Europe, what's happening to Black people in the diaspora, really. That being said, so for me, the Black Lives Matter movement is a movement that was initially started in 2014, just around the extra judicial killings of Black people in America. It was started by people who were very close to the victims. And I think it kind of grew, to address issues around systemic racism. And obviously now it's a lot around policing. And for me, it really is a way of imagining a future, a different future for Black people. And what I'm appreciating about it now is that there are a lot of feminist voices that are coming through in that movement. I think there are starting to be some very clear demands. So one of them being the abolition of prisons, the abolition of policing in America, and I think a lot of other requests, right, that really speak to the quality of Black life. And what I've also really appreciated about that movement is its respect for feminists like Angela Davis, Ruth Gilmore, who have been doing this work around liberating Black people in America. And so to just answer your second question about why it is we seem to only pay attention when it's Black Lives protests in America, I think we really can't ignore how important a force or how big a force, the USA is. I think we constantly engage America through, its culture, especially Black culture, So there's obviously like that cultural hegemony. We can't ignore US imperialism across the globe. But for me, what really encourages me to support the Black Lives Matter movement is because I see how Black people across the globe consume Black culture, right? How we engage. So for me, it would be a problem if we engage this culture, as consumers, and we really ignored the socio-political context of America and, the open air prison that Black people reside in. So I think we would have been a part of the problem if we were just consumers of the culture, but not necessarily, speaking out for Black people across the diaspora. Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
And Sihle, I think what's so fascinating, right? Just to continue the conversation around the importance of Black Lives Matter, especially when it now comes into the African context, right? So, I mean, you've mentioned a very pertinent point to say that we are big consumers of the African culture, especially in the diaspora and in the American scene. But when we bring it back home, beginning of lockdown, etc., and even before that, there are so many issues that happen to Africans in our own space, in our own country, police brutality and all that stuff. And we never speak about it until something else happens somewhere. And I think that's a sad situation. But, just in your opinion, how do we become better citizens, at home first, before we actually just wait for someone else to make a ruckus somewhere else, and then we try and make inferences to say, but this also happened to us?
Yeah. That's such an important point. I've always wondered why it is South Africans especially aren't up in arms, because we also experience extrajudicial killings. We also experience police brutality. In fact, we experience police brutality at higher levels than American citizens do, American Black citizens do. So what I've noted is that there's a lot of complacency in South Africa. We don't have political will, I would call it. And it really saddens me that we aren't able to mobilize these causes. So going forward, I would just want us to start organizing, to start getting mad in the manner in which we should be. And also what I've noticed about the South African context is that there's a lot of respectability politics. There's a lot of morality arguments. So even if you look at how victims of police brutality are treated, there's always a victim blaming in a very similar way to the way we victim blame victims of gender-based violence, really. You look at, I think there was this awful case of an immigrant, being dragged by the police and then set alight. I may be getting the details a bit fuzzy, but even then there was justification, around xenophobic violence. What was he doing in South Africa? Why is this foreign national here? So we aren't always able to provide a united front, which is very important when you're resisting against such a powerful force such as the police, right? Because policing is institutionalized. It is backed up with the government. So what would it mean for South Africans, for civilians to arms against the police and police brutality?
Yeah. I think maybe it would really be important to, I know you said that we have no political will, especially as South Africans, right? Do you, because maybe we don't understand literally the power or what systematic racism is and how it impacts our lives on a daily basis, or maybe a certain ignorance that we perceive about the world that we live
in? Yeah. For me, I think it's twofold. There is an element of ignorance, but there's also an element of arrogance and complacency. And I think we'll speak about that aspect when we delve into, you know, the negation of intersectionality, and how it's almost being bastardized, you know. So just on the ignorance, yeah, I think the South African government isn't really dedicated to educating its populace. So it isn't interested in educating South Africans about their history. You look at just like the basic education syllabus, there isn't really an interest in politicizing young South Africans. But at the same time, I wouldn't expect a government to do that. That really has to be the work of us activists and organizers, you know, who impart this political knowledge into different demographics, really. I'm one who's recently started spending time on Twitter, and it always shocks me just like the responses that people have either to homophobia, misogyny. There's always just like this support for it, and it's very moralistic, right? So I think there's a lot of work that has to be done, but obviously that ignorance does stem from the disparities that exist within African societies, you know. I think the three of us are in a position of privilege because, you know, we have access to resources, we have access to knowledge, we have access to all these different tools that allow us to begin, you know, imagining this future that's free of police brutality, that's free of racism, that's free, you know, of all these oppressive systems. But for someone who doesn't have as much access, what then, you know, is the resource? Yeah.
And I suppose maybe it would be difficult for them to have the conversation because they experience yeah. Sorry.
It's unfortunate. True.
It is quite unfortunate. And, you know, when you mention social media, I actually have to take some days off, you know, when people start to have like deep rooted social conversations and you can see almost like their lens and you're saying, but how do you think like this, right? But then, you know, you mentioned that we are also coming from a place of privilege and we have access to all this information and we've had to learn and unlearn certain biases in ourselves that we hold true because of, you know, how we grew up in the environments in which we're coming from. But just taking that, I mean, that's then a great segue into the intersectionality of all these systems that are attached, you know, to what's happening right now in the world. Yeah. But just, you know, the intersectionality of it all can be multifold, right? So it could be gender, it could be culture, and just ethnicity, etc. Can you tell us, Sihle, to say, you know, what is the role and the importance of understanding intersectionality, especially when we're trying to debunk a topic like Black Lives Matter? And, you know, how do we actually curate a society, you know, that is living in this idealistic future that we imagine and envision?
Oh my, you know, intersectionality is such an important framework. Really rely on it in a lot of my work. And I just want to mention that it was obviously coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, but there were a lot of Black women, more especially, who were doing that intersectional work, or at least who were thinking along that line of looking at their positionality and looking at their subjecthood within these obviously intersecting systems of oppression. I think there was the Kumbahi River Collective. And even in South Africa, one prominent activist, Fatima Mia, during apartheid, also made like similar observations on the differences between Black women protesting against apartheid and white women who were, you know, allies, to speak. And what she said is that the stakes weren't as high for white women, you understand? Right? Because for Black children, especially around, she was making this commentary around June 16, and she was saying that for Black women, it was their children, right, who were faced with this violence, and for Black mothers, it was a real threat, but for white women, it wasn't the same. You know, and there've been a lot of other analyses that look at Black women's experiences vis-a-vis white women's experiences. right, to look at the racial dynamic that separates these two in South Africa. And this was happening as early as the 1970s, you know, and Crenshaw penned that seminal paper around the 80s and then the 90s, continuing that work. Yeah, I think for me, it's very important to be cognizant of how systems intersect, more especially oppressive systems. But one thing I do want to caution against, one thing that I have seen, I think people look at intersectionality and they look at it from a perspective of identity, right? So, so these systems of oppression then become identity markers, right? So people then understand themselves to be racialized, to be gendered, and to be classed in particular ways. And then they take those on as identities. So you would then be a Black woman, a poor Black woman. And I really don't like that type of thinking. And this is personally for me, right? Because I think it then tends to be very essentialist, right? And you tend to think about these markers as very stable, which we know that they aren't. I like to think more about intersectionality as creating subjectivities, right? So when I say subjectivities, it means how you are positioned in society, how society relates to you, right? And what are the possibilities for you within said society. And also what's very important, or why I really rely on thinking around subjectivity, is then I can also think around subjects and power. There's a lot of work being done, more especially by Judith Butler, at least continuing from Foucault and speaking around how subjects are created through subjugation. So I rely on ideas such as those to think about how Black women are positioned within societies, how even the marker Black woman is created, right, through these racialized and gendered categories. So yeah, I think that's my commentary on intersectionality. I think I may have missed the question. Again, I may have gone off on a tangent. Yeah.
No. I think, you really did answer the question. I think just over and above that, it was just to say, people, your thinking is something that's also quite new to me, and I'm fascinated around, the thinking around subjectivity. And, when we speak about intersectionality, I think like most of the conversation is just centered around, what you've just turned to say, we then make it a marker of identity, to say a Black woman who is in this type of situation, whereas we need to look at holistically what is happening in that particular subject environment. And
can I just come in here? I think I'm formulating more speaking. And also I tend to shy away from this idea of identity because I do think that it's rooted in capitalism. It's very individualistic, right? And it really does essentialize one's position. So it goes back to the me. But if you think around subjectivity, you also look at how other subjectivities are created by these very same systems. And I think this goes back to our thinking around why must we be in solidarity with Black Lives Matter? You look at the experiences of Black people in America, you look at Indigenous people, you look at Aboriginal peoples in Australia, and all those subjectivities are created by the very same apparatuses, right? So they're created through this racializing, this gendering, and this classing through the capitalist system. So I think for me, that's why it's important to not only think through subjectivity, but to stand in solidarity with these people because we have a common enemy.
Yeah. Sihle, earlier on you were also speaking around, the element of having the group that is oppressed and they're fighting for their related freedoms. But we also speak about having allies, right? And the quote that you just mentioned to say that, white women that were involved in the protest didn't have like their stakes weren't high for them, right? Because they didn't have, you know, the much required involvement in it or anything to lose in that. But what is the importance of having allies, and what is their role as allies that they actually need to understand? Because I think what we've heard a lot is when we have white, you know, I'm just going to speak quite broadly to say, when we have, you know, white allies that come into the conversation, especially around Black Lives Matter, and then they say, oh no, I'm in solidarity because I also have Black friends. Is that the right approach to being an ally? Or how you know, how do they get educated themselves?
Oh man, you know, I really don't like the notion of ally, and even in my work, I really don't do a lot of work around allyship. I think there's this one author, I wish I could share his book with you. His name is Marquise Bay, and he does a lot of work around allyship. And what they say is that they also don't rely on this notion of allyship because it means that you can opt out, right? So you only assist when it benefits you, and then when it's not to your benefit, then you opt out. And it really does recreate just how maybe lonely marginalized people are, right? And that they can never have or they can never rely on a consistent system of support. So, but he encourages that it's important to formulate coalitions, right? And I think I also rely on that type of thinking. So you look for people who are not necessarily similarly marginalized, but who understand marginalization, who understand marginality. And that's why I always think around solidarity with other oppressed people. I'm not looking to white people to come join us, you know, in liberating ourselves. I'm looking for other people who have experienced, you know, either the hand of colonialists, who have experienced slavery, not, you know, obviously in now, but who, you know, whose existence come from like that slave narrative. So yeah, that's it for me. Just raging with other marginalized bodies, not necessarily seeking the assistance of people who can easily opt out. And it's very important to formulate coalitions and do coalitional work.
So I kind of like want to kind of I like giving reference in the context of our climate, so that people can kind of get an understanding when they understand the familiarity in their environment in terms of kind of protest or activity that is similar to Black Lives Matter, not in the exact message, but in the movement, right? And I liked movements that we had in terms of Fees Must Fall, and you know, when Rose University has the art list, and they were not particularly saying Black Lives Matter, but the messaging and how the protest played out was in that context, right? So maybe could you explain maybe those similarities, if they are there, or if there are other kinds of protests that occurred in our country and across Africa that reminded us of kind of the current fights that are happening in our context?
You know, there definitely are inferences, because I think wherever Black people are gathered in protest, gathered against, you know, their marginalization, gathered against the oppression, I think that reverberates, or that at least from that we can draw inferences with other similar protests. And South Africa has such a rich history of protest, but once again, something that I've observed is that we haven't been able to join forces as society. You know, you always see like these disparate protests, a protest in a location somewhere, and maybe a GBV protest, but we are never really able to come together and say, listen, we're unhappy with the, you know, we're unhappy with the violence that we're experiencing as a society. I've always thought of violence as something, you know, that ties us together as different people in this country, you know, different marginalized entities in this country. But we've never really been able to utilize, you know, that marginality to demand change. Yeah, so even if you look at Fees Must Fall, once again, it was a very small, very specific protest around a particular, around fees. And even though there were talks about using this as a catalyst for bigger demands, for, demands around youth access to education, around different elements around education, even poverty, there wasn't necessarily any backing from society to say that, listen, we can use this to galvanize for greater societal freedoms. So
Yeah.
that's what I mean. And even this what's happening in America now, it's been a long time coming, because you look at how Black Lives Matter, it wasn't always welcome. How it started, it wasn't welcomed. There were people saying that all lives matter as a counter, right? It took roughly 5 to 6 years and more murder and more killings of Black people to spark, that societal outrage. So yeah, even though there's similarities, we can make inferences. What is really important is just that we work in unity. No Name has been doing such great work on Twitter more especially, and she speaks about Black radical unity, and that's what's necessary in America, in South Africa, everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Thanks, Sihle. I'm really enjoying this conversation, right?
Me too.
And I'm just like, oh my gosh, there's so much to learn. And I think that's the beauty of having someone that comes with, with a different understanding and experience to this conversation. You also educate us in the process. But we've spoken about a lot of things. And just, as we're moving to the end of this conversation, you spoke about, the importance of allyship versus coalition. That's something that I'm going to go back and think about, right?
Yeah.
But just generally, with everything that's happening, everything that we've spoken about, and I think, as much as, the conversation is important, understanding that, police brutality within the American landscape is not right. Back home on the African continent, there's so many social injustices that are happening to us and, people that are here on the continent. How do we, what's the first step for us to actually create a progressive culture and progressive society? What are the actionable things that we can start to take today as the youth, or anyone for that matter?
Yeah. This is something that I've been thinking about, especially now because of lockdown and the restrictions that have been imposed. And I'm really someone who really likes to be where the action is. I like to lend my physical body. So be it by protest, be it by writing, different things that I can do. So being under lockdown has been really difficult, especially with everything going on. Once again, the space of gender-based violence, the murdering of women really sorry about that. My battery's about to die. So has really left me thinking, what is it that I can do? And there's different things. So firstly, we can educate ourselves, and we can make the effort to educate others. People are reading resources. I've also compiled resources that I can share with you. We can share with each other, and also just taking the time to educate people from different cultural backgrounds, or about what's going on or about specific causes. That's one. And also donating. I think a lot of people think that maybe because they aren't super rich, they don't have the resources. But there are a lot of people, in movements who require assistance during this time, but also, people in South Africa are struggling financially during this time. So also to assist them. I really do believe in empathy and compassion. So I do believe in helping out wherever you can, right? And then there's also just moving with empathy and understanding, being open to learn, right? And these are things that you can do yourself, for yourself. And I think maybe once we're allowed out, really, we can start taking up space, protesting. I think that's really important, making things stop, using our collective outrage to bring about change in meaningful ways. And even if there's a protest and things before lockdown, I really do think that it's important for us to lend ourselves, to those protests. And I'm saying this from a person who wasn't really a protester, who didn't really come from a culture of protesting, but who really had to learn that if you stand for something, you have to get as uncomfortable as possible. And I think always raging, for change, always raging with the oppressed, those who may be oppressed in a different way from you. I think that's really important. And being consistent, being always there, not sometimes, not when it suits you. And then I also think that cultural work is very important. What you guys are doing is very important. Knowledge production, especially by Black people, for Black people, is very important, because we're beginning to create these archives and creating these blueprints for, this future that we imagine. So that's really, really important.
Well, thank you, Sihle, for joining us today. This was a wonderful conversation. I think if we can gather anything from that, literally just, having a raging for change in any kind of space, any expression, that you are passionate about, because we can all make a small change in our own environment by just being passionate about it. If we speak up, if we are passionate about, and we are consistent towards our rage about that, then I think we can make some changes in our environments. And also just being politically radical. We really don't come from a culture of protest, and we've been taught in the kind of environments, the schools that we have been, that protest is wrong, right? And so because of that context, we're afraid that if we are associated with protest, that we are radical, that we are uncouth, that we are unruly, and no one should want to associate themselves with us. And that's how maybe associations such as the EFF are kind of picked as, radical protesters who no one should want to associate themselves with. We should, from that identity, because we could potentially get somewhere if people realize that our rage is serious, and we could potentially use it to get. So thank you for that conversation. Thank you for, for the revelations of the perspective, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and thank you once again for having me. This has also been very enlightening. I think you guys have really challenged me to really think about my positions and to be able to articulate them. So thank you for that.
Thank you for coming. Thank you guys for watching again this show. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. And just give us your thoughts on what's happening in terms of Black Lives Matter, the intersectionality of everything that we've just spoken about, and give us your thoughts on that. Thank you for coming and watching.